In writing your research paper, you have three challenges. One is to research the information, one is to put together your argument, and the third is to document your sources. So today we're going to be talking about the third challenge, documentation. What does it mean? It simply means giving credit where credit is due. Every single time you borrow an idea from a source, and you must do so in order to write this whole paper, you must tell me which particular source that particular idea came from. There are four common problems with documentation, and the first occurs, the string of pearls, when you gather all these pearls of wisdom from all over and string them together without any thought of your own. But look at it like this. You're putting two and two together, and the conclusion that you draw from that should be, that's where your original thinking comes from. So string of pearls, bad idea. Second is an under-researched paper when you don't have enough sources in your paper. And the third relates to that, because then you turn to one particular source and go back to it over and over again. So basically your whole paper is written based on that one source, that's overworked data. And sometimes you under-document, meaning you're not always careful about telling me where you got your ideas from. And you must be really, really careful, because then you could be accused of plagiarism, of passing off someone else's ideas as your own. What does documentation involve? It involves two major things. One is citing sources within a paper, and the other is writing your bibliography. And today we're just going to focus on citing sources within the paper. But what must you cite? What must you document? So anytime you use a direct quotation, or even if you quote just a word or phrase from a source, you got to cite. Even if you summarize and paraphrase everything in your own words, but it's someone else's ideas, you got to cite your source. And of course, other things like source within source, or even incomplete references. So you want to give credit in almost every single paragraph of your 8 to 10 page paper. You got to tell me where ideas came from. What needs to be documented, what does not need to be documented is common knowledge. So if I said the sun rises in the east, or President Obama is the current president of the United States, well, duh, I don't need to document all that. Here is some general advice about using sources. I know I'm repeating myself, but every single time you use a borrowed idea in your paper, you must cite your source. That means in pretty much every single paragraph of your 8 to 10 page paper, you will have citations. In general, you want to keep quotations to a minimum. It's much, much better to write things in your own words, and that's why I asked you to do a summary assignment early on. The third thing to keep in mind is if you do have a quotation, don't just throw it into a paragraph. If you do that, you'll have a floating quotation or a drop quotation, and your reader won't know why exactly you're using the quotation or what point you want him or her to note. So these are three things to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is when you use a quotation or when you introduce someone else's ideas, don't keep saying says, so-and-so says. Here's a nice list of ideas. You also have a similar list in your book, but you could use a variety of words in order to lead up to someone else's ideas. So now we'll talk about quotations, how to punctuate quotations. Here are three examples. In the first example, the quotation is interrupted by the words the speech coach urged. So note how I'm opening and closing the quotation before, where the comma goes, where the period goes at the very end. Please make a note of all this. All this is in your book as well, and also in the websites I've linked to in the assignment handout. In the second example, you have a lead-in sentence and then a quotation. But after the quotation, the writer goes on in his own words, and notice how that quotation is punctuated. And in the third example, only a phrase is quoted, the phrase double parked. But even if it's just that, you got to put quotation marks, and then you got to cite the source correctly. So the point to note here is every time you use a quotation, you got to punctuate it correctly, having the commas and periods and quotation marks in the right places. If you have a long quotation that is more than 4 lines long, then you would use the block format. And you would, first of all, you would write a sentence of your own leading up to the quotation, indent the whole quotation, and this time you will not put quotation marks around the block quotation, and then you'll write the citation in a certain way. Let me show you an example. Here it is. So lead-in sentence, Stephen Levy sums up the web critics thus, and notice the colon at the end of that lead-in sentence because it's a complete sentence. Notice the block quotation indented, no quotation marks around it. And this time, notice where the period is. It's not after the parentheses as with the short quotations, but this time the period is placed here. Here are two situations. Normally, you should use a quotation as is, but sometimes you might say, let me add in one little word or change one word so that it makes fits in better with the rest of my paragraph. And every time you add something or change something in a quotation, you got to enclose that part in square brackets. So you see, about personal space, that part has been added and therefore put in square brackets. But you should do this very, very, very minimally. The second situation is when you have to drop some words. You don't want the whole quotation, you just want some words in the beginning and at the end. And to indicate that you have dropped some words, use the ellipsis. Notice the 3 dots in the middle. That punctuation mark is called the ellipsis. And of course, when you use indirect quotations, when you're writing your paraphrase or summary, unless you're using an exact phrase from somewhere, no need for quotation marks. Sometimes you might have a quotation within a quotation. So you're reading a source and that source is quoting someone else. Notice single quotation marks around breathing room, double quotation marks around the whole quotation. And again, this is not a common occurrence. And if you do run into it, then you can look it up in your book or in the website I've linked to. Now let's talk about parenthetical citations. That a parenthetical citation is where you give credit to your source, and you would do so at the end of the sentence where you mention an idea taken from that source. And this is really important in your paper. Here are some general guidelines for the parenthetical citations. You would place a citation at the end of the sentence and then put the period after the parentheses. You would not put anything inside the citation unless it's the title of an article and you want to put quotation marks around it. You would not use P or PP or pages or whatever. You just write the number of the page. And if you've already referred to the author's name in your sentence, you'll just use the page number in parentheses. So let's look at examples. So first example, Stephen Levy posits that, and then I have the quotation. End the quotation, put quotation marks at the end, and then the page number in parentheses, period after that. In the second example, I've paraphrased what Levy said, but even though it's a paraphrase, I still got to cite my source. I mention his name in my lead-in sentence, write the page number at the end. And the third example is a paraphrase too, but this time I didn't mention the author's name in my sentence. Therefore, in my parentheses, I have to have his last name and space, the page number, and then close the citation. So these are some quick pointers as to what you'll be encountering in your documentation assignment. More information in your book and in the websites I've linked to. And of course, you can always call me or email me with questions.